Every night for 40 years, Samuel climbed the 127 steps to the top of Beacon Point Lighthouse, checking equipment that most people considered obsolete. The Coast Guard kept threatening to shut it down and relocate him. They had no idea that Samuel's nightly vigil was preventing disasters they'd never even hear about. Samuel Morrison was 68 years old when he died, and for the last 40 years of his life, he had been the loneliest man on the Maine coast. At least that's what everyone thought. Beacon Point Lighthouse sat on a jagged outcrop of rocks 3 miles off the coast of Millfield, Maine. It was a 40-foot tower of weathered stone that had been guiding ships safely to harbor since 1847. But by 1983, when Samuel took the job as lighthouse keeper, the Coast Guard had installed modern navigation systems that made lighthouses largely obsolete. Most lighthouse keepers had been reassigned or retired. The few remaining lighthouses were automated, their beams controlled by computers and timers rather than human hands. But Beacon Point was different. The Lighthouse Commission, influenced by local historical societies and tourism boards, had decided to keep one traditional lighthouse keeper on duty as a living monument to maritime history. Or so he thought. The Coast Guard had been trying to shut down Beacon Point Lighthouse for 15 years. Every few months, an official would make the boat trip out to the island to try to convince Samuel to accept a transfer to a mainland position. "Samuel, this is pointless," Coast Guard Captain Jennifer Walsh told him during one of her visits in 2019. "Ships don't need lighthouses anymore. They have GPS, radar, satellite navigation. You're maintaining equipment that nobody uses." Or so he thought. The Coast Guard had been trying to shut down Beacon Point Lighthouse for 15 years. Every few months, an official would make the boat trip out to the island to try to convince Samuel to accept a transfer to a mainland position. "Samuel, this is pointless," Coast Guard Captain Jennifer Walsh told him during one of her visits in 2019. "Ships don't need lighthouses anymore. They have GPS, radar, satellite navigation. You're maintaining equipment that nobody uses." Samuel had applied for the job because he needed to get away from everything. His wife had died in a car accident, his only son had been killed in Vietnam, and his small construction business had failed during the recession. At 58, broken and grieving, he saw the lighthouse keeper position as a chance to disappear from a world that had taken everything from him. The job came with a small salary, a cottage at the base of the lighthouse, and complete isolation. Supply boats came once a month with food, fuel, and mail. Other than that, Samuel was entirely alone on his rocky island, 3 miles from the nearest human being. For most people, or so he thought. The Coast Guard had been trying to shut down Beacon Point Lighthouse for 15 years. Every few months, an official would make the boat trip out to the island to try to convince Samuel to accept a transfer to a mainland position. "Samuel, this is pointless," Coast Guard Captain Jennifer Walsh told him during one of her visits in 2019. "Ships don't need lighthouses anymore. They have GPS, radar, satellite navigation. You're maintaining equipment that nobody uses." Samuel, now 76, was as stubborn as the day he'd arrived. "The light still burns every night, Captain, and as long as it does, I'll be here to tend it." "But why? What's the point of keeping a light burning that no one needs?" "How do you know no one needs it?" Samuel asked quietly. Captain Walsh had heard this response before. Samuel always implied that the lighthouse was still serving some important purpose, but he never explained what that purpose might be. The Coast Guard assumed it was just the attachment of an old man to a job that had given his life meaning. They had no idea how literally true that was. Every evening at sunset, Samuel would begin his nightly routine. He'd climb the narrow spiral staircase inside the lighthouse, 127 stone steps that he'd climbed over 14,000 times in 4 decades. At the top, In the lantern room, he'd check the massive Fresnel lens, clean the glass, and ensure that the beacon was functioning properly. But that wasn't all Samuel did during his nightly vigil. He also maintained a radio setup that the Coast Guard didn't know about, and every night, as he tended the light, he listened. Samuel listened to maritime radio traffic, weather reports, distress signals, and emergency broadcasts. He monitored shipping lanes, tracked storm systems, and kept detailed notes about vessel movements in the waters around Beacon Point. Most nights, his listening produced nothing more than routine radio chatter. But some nights, Samuel heard things that made his 40 years of isolation worthwhile. Like the night in 1987 when he picked up a faint mayday call from a fishing vessel that had lost power in rough seas 12 miles northeast of Beacon Point. The Coast Guard station hadn't received the signal, the boat's radio was too weak and the weather was interfering with transmission. But Samuel, high up in his lighthouse and listening carefully, heard every word. He immediately radioed the Coast Guard, relaying the vessel's position and situation. Within an hour, a rescue helicopter had located the fishing boat and saved all 4 crew members. The Coast Guard never knew that Samuel had been the one to alert them. He'd called it in as an anonymous tip, and the official report credited the rescue to alert monitoring by Coast Guard Communications. That was the first life Samuel saved from his lighthouse. It wouldn't be the last. Over the years, Samuel's unauthorized radio monitoring had resulted in dozens of similar interventions: boats in distress, swimmers caught in riptides, kayakers who'd paddled too far from shore and couldn't make it back against the wind. Samuel had quietly coordinated rescues for all of them. He kept detailed records of every incident in a series of logbooks that he stored in a locked cabinet in the lighthouse's lower room. Each entry included the date, time, nature of the emergency, actions taken, and outcome. But Samuel never told anyone about his secret rescue operation. As far as the Coast Guard knew, Samuel Morrison was just a harmless old man who refused to accept that his job had become obsolete. The truth was that Samuel had become something the Coast Guard didn't even realize they needed: an unofficial guardian angel for everyone who ventured onto the waters around Beacon Point. His most dramatic rescue had happened in 2003 during a late October storm that had caught the Weather Service by surprise. Samuel, monitoring his radio as always, heard a desperate call from a family whose sailboat had been dismasted and was taking on water about 8 miles south of the lighthouse. The Coast Guard station was dealing with multiple emergencies that night. The storm had caught several vessels unprepared, and the family's call had been buried in the chaos of radio traffic. Samuel realized that no one had acknowledged their mayday. Without hesitation, Samuel fired up the lighthouse's emergency generator and turned the beacon to its highest intensity. Then he began manually operating the light, creating a deliberate pattern: 3 long flashes, 3 short flashes, 3 long flashes. SOS in Morse code, repeated over and over. The sailboat family, drifting helplessly in the storm, saw the signal and realized that someone on shore knew they were in trouble. They managed to stay calm and keep their boat afloat until Samuel was finally able to get through to the Coast Guard on a clear radio channel and vector a rescue boat to their location. The official report credited the successful rescue to alert observation by lighthouse personnel, but it never mentioned that Samuel had improvised the whole operation on his own initiative. By 2015, Samuel had quietly coordinated the rescue of over 200 people in various maritime emergencies: fishermen, pleasure boaters, kayakers, swimmers, even a few people who had fallen off ferries or cruise ships passing through the area. None of them ever knew that a lonely lighthouse keeper had been the first person to notice they were in trouble. Samuel's health began declining in his late 70s. The daily climb up 127 steps became increasingly difficult, and his hands weren't as steady as they once were when operating the radio equipment. But he refused all suggestions that he retire or accept help. "The light needs tending," he would tell anyone who asked, "and someone needs to keep watch." On March 15, 2023, Samuel Morrison climbed the lighthouse stairs for the last time. He was found 3 days later by the monthly supply boat, having died peacefully in his sleep in the cottage at the base of the lighthouse. The beacon was still burning. Captain Walsh, now a rear admiral, came personally to oversee the closure of Beacon Point Lighthouse. It was the end of an era. Samuel had been the last traditional lighthouse keeper on the entire East Coast. As Coast Guard personnel cleared out Samuel's belongings, they discovered the locked cabinet in the lower room of the lighthouse. Inside were 40 leather-bound logbooks, each one meticulously maintained and filled with Samuel's careful handwriting. Admiral Walsh opened the first logbook, expecting to find routine maintenance records and weather observations. Instead, she found something that made her sit down hard on the lighthouse's stone floor. March 15, 1987. Heard Mayday from fishing vessel Mary Catherine, approximately 12 miles northeast of Lighthouse. Coast Guard station not responding. Weather interference likely. Relayed distress call anonymously. Rescue helicopter dispatched 11:47 p.m. All 4 crew members recovered safely. April 3, 1987. Observed distress flare 6 miles south of Lighthouse, 2:15 a.m. Single kayaker in trouble. Alerted Coast Guard. Patrol boat launched 2:45 a.m. Kayaker rescued, treated for hypothermia. May 18, 1987. Radio distress call from pleasure craft Weekend Warrior. Engine failure, drifting toward rocks on east side of Beacon Point. Coast Guard busy with commercial vessel emergency. Used lighthouse beam to signal warning to vessel. They dropped anchor and avoided rocks. Coordinated rescue once Coast Guard available. Entry after entry, year after year. 40 years of documented rescues, alerts, and interventions. Each one carefully recorded with military precision, each one representing lives saved by Samuel's vigilant monitoring. Admiral Walsh called her staff over. "Get me every maritime rescue report for this area going back 40 years, she ordered. Cross-reference them with these logbook entries. The investigation took 3 months. What they discovered was extraordinary. Samuel Morrison had been directly or indirectly responsible for saving the lives of 278 people over his 4 decades as lighthouse keeper. His radio monitoring had prevented countless accidents, his emergency interventions had coordinated dozens of rescues, and his lighthouse beacon had guided vessels to safety during storms, equipment failures, and medical emergencies. But he had never taken credit for any of it. Every official report attributed the successful rescues to routine Coast Guard operations, or alert civilian observers, or effective emergency response protocols. Samuel had spent 40 years being the most effective maritime rescue coordinator on the Maine coast, and he had done it all anonymously from his supposedly... The final entry in Samuel's last logbook was dated the day before he died.
March 14th, 2023. Quiet night. No emergencies, no distress calls, light burning steady. All vessels in area accounted for and safe. Weather forecast good for next 48 hours. Note, health declining, may not be able to continue much longer. Hope Coast Guard will consider maintaining radio watch from this position even after Lighthouse automated. The view from up here covers waters that can't be monitored from mainland stations. Someone should keep listening. Lives depend on it.
Admiral Walsh wiped tears from her eyes as she read the final entry. For 40 years, the Coast Guard had been trying to convince Samuel that his job was pointless, that lighthouse keepers were obsolete, that nobody needed the services he was providing. The truth was that Samuel Morrison had been the most important person in their entire maritime rescue operation, and they'd never even known he existed. 6 months later, the Coast Guard established the Samuel Morrison Maritime Monitoring Station at Beacon Point Lighthouse. The lighthouse beacon still operates every night, now fully automated. But more importantly, the lighthouse now houses a state-of-the-art radio monitoring station staffed 24/7 by Coast Guard personnel trained in emergency response. The official dedication plaque reads, "In memory of Samuel Morrison, 1944-2023, lighthouse keeper and guardian angel of Beacon Point. For 40 years, he proved that the most important work is often done by those who seek no recognition for doing it." But there's another memorial to Samuel that means even more than the official plaque. In the maritime community of coastal Maine, word had spread about the lighthouse keeper who had spent 4 decades secretly saving lives. Fishing captains, pleasure boaters, and professional mariners began making pilgrimages to Beacon Point, not to see the historic lighthouse, but to pay their respects to Samuel Morrison. Many of them were people Samuel had helped rescue. Others were family members of people whose lives he had saved. Some were just mariners who understood what it meant to have someone watching over them during the dangerous business of making a living from the sea. But there's another memorial to Samuel that means even more than the official plaque. In the maritime community of coastal Maine, word had spread about the lighthouse keeper who had spent 4 decades secretly saving lives. Fishing captains, pleasure boaters, and professional mariners began making pilgrimages to Beacon Point, not to see the historic lighthouse, but to pay their respects to Samuel Morrison. Many of them were people Samuel had helped rescue. Others were family members of people whose lives he had saved. Some were just mariners who understood what it meant to have someone watching over them during the dangerous business of making a living from the sea.
They come throughout the year, but especially on March 15th, the anniversary of Samuel's death. They gather at the base of the lighthouse, share stories about maritime rescues and close calls, and observe a moment of silence for the man who proved that no one is ever truly alone as long as someone, somewhere, is keeping watch. Captain, now Admiral Walsh, speaks at the annual memorial service. Samuel Morrison spent 40 years alone on this island, she tells the gathered crowd, but he was never really alone. He was connected to every person who ventured onto these waters. He was part of every family that worried about a loved one at sea. He was present in every emergency, every rescue, every safe return to harbor. The Coast Guard has a motto, Semper Paratus, always ready. Samuel Morrison embodied that motto better than any of us who wore the uniform. He was always ready, always listening, always watching, always prepared to help when help was needed. We thought Samuel was keeping an obsolete lighthouse running for sentimental reasons. What he was really doing was keeping faith with every mariner who trusted that someone, somewhere, was looking out for them. The lighthouse beacon still flashes every night, just as it has for over 150 years. But now, when mariners see that light, they remember Samuel Morrison and know that the tradition of keeping watch continues, because some jobs are never really obsolete, some vigils are never really unnecessary, and some people are never really alone, as long as others are willing to keep the light burning and maintain the watch. Samuel Morrison had no visitors for 40 years, but he had been visiting everyone on the ocean around Beacon Point, keeping them safe from a distance, protecting them from dangers they never even knew about. The lighthouse keeper who never had visitors had spent 4 decades being the most important visitor in the lives of 278 people who made it safely home because he was there, keeping watch, keeping faith, and keeping the light burning.